Kia ora everybody, welcome to our last block of content. We're going to look at the urinary system mostly, and we're going to touch on some of the structures and basic functions of the reproductive system. So let's kick off with the urinary system. We're going to look at location and structure of the urinary system, so the different components that make up the urinary system. Look at the physiology of a nephron, which is actually going to make up the long answer question for this week. And part of that process of knowing the physiology of a nephron is the formation of urine and how that contributes to the body's homeostasis. So let's just go for a really quick summary of what the urinary system does, how it does it, and why it does it. So urinary system filters nitrogenous wastes from the blood and helps to regulate water, electrolyte, and acid-base balances. The nitrogen waste comes from the breakdown of proteins. So molecularly, protein is made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And during the metabolic process of breaking proteins down into amino acids, a waste product of that nitrogen is created, and our urinary system filters that and removes it. The kidneys filter our blood, so the regulation of water, electrolytes, and acid bases is all done through our blood passing through our kidneys and filtering what's in our blood. The nephrons are the structural or functional unit of a kidney, and they filter, secrete, and reabsorb electrolytes under the direction of hormones. So the urinary system links quite heavily with the endocrine system from last week. And the kidneys are directly involved in maintaining proper blood pressure, which is essential for delivering oxygen and nutrients to tissues for proper filtration of blood by the kidneys themselves. So maintaining a healthy blood pressure within the cardiovascular system helps with blood flow. Not enough pressure decreases blood flow. Too much pressure and you're putting a lot of stress on the structures of the cardiovascular system. So now we're just going to sort of look at the functions a little bit more closely. So eliminating wastes. So as I said, nitrogen, which is a byproduct of breaking down protein in our diet. Toxins are things that cause harm to the body or that the body doesn't use, so we need to get rid of those. And drugs. So drugs within the system are also gotten rid of through our urine, and that's why you can test that kind of stuff in urine tests. Maintain blood volume. So remember, if we think about what makes up blood, plasma, which is the biggest component of blood, is mostly water. 55% of blood is made of plasma, and I think like 90 or 95% of plasma is water. So we can maintain and regulate blood volume by how much water we have in. So if we drink a lot of water or don't drink a lot of water, our kidneys help regulate whether we get rid of excess water or hold on to fluid so that our blood volume stays the same. Maintaining our water and electrolyte balance. Electrolytes are atoms that have a charge, so things like the sodium and potassium ions that help regulate impulses are electrolytes. So maintaining those balances are important for homeostasis and most processes within the body. And then maintaining acid-base balance, so making sure that our blood has the right pH. So if things become too acidic, which can happen through like metabolic processes, we're able to keep the pH of our blood at a homeostatic level or in balance. And all of this happens through the process of a three-step process of filtration, reabsorption, and then secretion. And this helps to maintain homeostasis within the body by excreting unwanted material and then keeping wanted material, so sending back to the body. Anatomy, so you'll need to be able to understand where the kidneys are. They're located posteriorly, so partially protected by the last two ribs. So they're at the back but within the rib cage. The kidneys alone perform the functions of the urinary system and manufacture urine in that process. So they are the functional structure of the urinary system. And specifically within a kidney, you have these little structures called nephrons, and there's approximately 1 million nephrons within each kidney. So there's a lot of these filtering systems within each kidney. And then the paired ureters, the single urinary bladder, that should say urethras, I'll change that, provide temporary storage and transportation channels for removal. So we've got the ureters, which connect the kidney to the bladder. You have the bladder, which stores urine, and then you have the urethra, which is the final tube to get rid of urine. So I'll just need to change that to urethra, not ureters. So asterisk this, you will need to know how to label these structures. Kidneys at the top, we got two ureters, one storage bladder, and then the urethra, which is the exit point. So be familiar with this diagram, be able to label it. Something to note, the big blue blood vessel that goes up is the inferior vena cava, so that's blood returning back to the heart, deoxygenated blood returning back to the heart. And the red blood vessel coming down is the aorta, so it comes off the aortic arch from the heart. Between 20 and 25% of your total blood volume, so the amount of blood in your body at any one time, 20 to 25% of that volume passes through your kidneys each minute, which, if you think about that, that's a lot of blood volume being processed every minute. So within a day, kidneys are working pretty hard. They produce about 1 to 2 liters of urine each day, and that sort of depends on things like how much fluid you are taking on board. If we have a look at a microscopic level of a kidney, so a kidney cut in half, we've got the cortex, which if you think about the adrenal glands from last week, the cortex was the outside or most superficial region. The medulla is deeper within the kidney, deep to the cortex. And then the pelvis, looks almost like coral, is the funnel-shaped tube which leads into the ureters. So that's where, after the filtering process happens within these nephrons, the urine which is created through the filtering reabsorption secretion process funnels through the pelvis into the ureters, which goes down into the bladder. And then the cleaned, filtered blood exits out through the vein, the renal vein. The term renal refers to kidneys, so even the renal system is something that you could use for the urinary system. So blood enters the kidney through the renal artery. So that's, remember in the previous slide we saw the big red aorta blood vessel coming down. So blood enters the kidney through this renal artery. It's represented by the red blood vessel here. Within the kidney, the renal arteries branch into increasingly smaller arteries that can carry blood to filtering units within the renal cortex, and these are the nephrons. So the nephrons are like the filtering systems. Once the nephron does its thing through its three-step process of filtration, reabsorption and secretion, that cleaned blood exits out through the renal vein, and then it would head up through that inferior vena cava back into the heart. And the product of that filtering system within the nephron would be urine, and it would be exiting through that coral-shaped structure within the kidney. So now we're going to zoom in even closer, and this wiggly thing is our nephron. It's going to be the structure of, or the diagram that we will use in the long answer question, which we'll go over in a bit more detail during the tutorials. But this is the filtering unit of the kidney, and if you remember a couple of slides back, I mentioned that there's upwards of 1 million of these within one kidney. So there's lots of these filtering systems. They filter waste from the blood, produce urine, and a bit of repetition. Each kidney contains over 1 million of these. It looks very complicated, but it's all to do with processing and filtering blood as it passes through that renal artery, and then that cleaned blood out through the renal vein, the product of that filtration heading out through the kidney into the ureters and into the bladder. The nephron itself, which is this big yellow like ball structure, which is in one nephron, and remember there's like up to 1 million of them, has two main structures. You've got the glomerulus, glomerulus. I'll practice that before tomorrow, which is this almost like a I don't know, like a hat that has a tube that comes off the back, and within there is the capillaries, the blood capillaries where blood passes through, and it's similar to how your alveoli in your lungs and the capillaries, blood capillaries, interact, but instead of it being gas or air and oxygen, CO2 exchanging, it's blood and filtering happening. So this structure here has a channel or a tube coming off the back, which you can see at the top there, which is your renal tubule. And that's the cup-shaped capsule which surrounds the glomerulus on one end, and then it twists and coils for about 3 centimeters before it leads to the collecting duct and exiting out of the kidneys. So that's the structure where our filtration, absorption, secretion happens. This is a nice simplified version of what a nephron looks like. So the one previous was quite complicated. This one's a little bit more easy to follow. If we start on the left hand side, you've got the renal artery, so that's blood coming in from the cardiovascular system, and then those arteries branch off into smaller afferent arterioles. So remember, the term afferent means coming away from, and then, like I said, similar to your lungs and your blood, there's an interaction between these arterioles and the glomerulus, or the renal tube, which is the yellow thing. As blood comes in through there, you have letter A, which is the first step in the filtration process, or urine creation process, glomerular filtration. So these are capillaries, right? So they're it's a semi-permeable membrane. There's pressure within that space, and that pressure squeezes water and solutes smaller than proteins through the capillary walls, through the pores of the glomerular capsule into this renal tube, which is the yellow part. So this is a passive process, and it's just, if you can fit through the holes, then you're squeezed through those holes. So it doesn't mean it's not always stuff that you want lost. It's just almost like a sieve. If it can fit through, it can. If it can't, it can't. And then the stuff that can't carries on through the capillaries. The stuff that does fit through collects in that renal tubule, the yellow part. Process B. So this is when blood is now is moving through all of that windy 3 centimeter space. The renal tube is still close by. You've got water that you need to retain, glucose, so sugar, amino acids, and any needed ions, and then transported out of that filtrate into the tubule cells and then back into our blood. So it moves through the renal tube cell wall and then back into the blood. So things like water, if you're holding on to water, retaining water, glucose, amino acids, and any of those needed ions, phosphate, potassium, sodium, any kind of salt that we're still needing to hold on to based on the regulation of electrolyte balance within our blood. And then the third part is tubular secretion. So this is when any substances that are still left in our arterioles, so we're still talking about the blood here, this is process C, is not needed and needs to be secreted out of the body. So this is tubular secretion, or secretion just as a simple term. So things like creatinine, drugs, any kind of drug that is in the system that shouldn't be there, ions that aren't needed, so salts that aren't needed. So maybe we're trying to get rid of some of these salts. So we've got like hydrogen ions from metabolism wastes, or maybe some potassium that's in excess that's not needed. This is removed from the blood and then put back into the renal tube, and that space is, that fluid in the renal tube is called filtrate. So just to quickly recap, process A is just a filtration system. There's pressure in the blood capillaries, forces things like water, anything smaller than proteins through the capillary walls, and it collects as filtrate in the renal tube. As that filtrate moves down, reabsorption of what the body does still need such as water, sugars, amino acids, any electrolytes that are needed are reabsorbed back into the blood. And then the last part is whatever's in the blood that isn't needed, that wasn't able to be filtered at the start, is then secreted into the filtrate, into the renal tube to be excreted out. So I guess the stuff to think of in the third process, letter C, are substances that were too big to be filtered out in the first place. So you've got this filtering system that happens that sends everything out that can fit into the renal tube. Then you reabsorb anything that was filtered that you do need, and then the body secretes from the blood into the renal tube anything that was unable to be filtered. Seems a little bit like a confusing process, but in that process, the body is regulating a lot of balance. And in this process, there's a mixture of active and passive transports. Especially in process B, is a combination of both active and passive transport. Urine as a sample can tell you a lot about the health of the body. So leukocytes, if you detect leukocytes in the urine, then it's an example of some kind of urinary tract infection potentially. So you got white blood cells in that space that are there fighting off an infection. If you've got a high amount of glucose, so sugar, your body is trying to get rid of, it's meaning that for some reason the body isn't absorbing or storing that glucose. So that could be an early sign of diabetes. So increased urination is a symptom of diabetes. Erythrocytes, which is red blood cells, you might want to write red blood cells there. That's indication of blood in the urinary tract, so some kind of bleeding in that space, which could be multiple things. Some kind of abrasion of some kind, or infection of some kind. And then different types of proteins can indicate things like overtraining, pregnancy, high blood pressure, heart failure, or even like severe hypertension. So there are lots of different types. I think there's about 20 different amino acids. So depending on what's in the urine can link to different symptoms of illness. Okay, so we're going to carry on with some of the structure. The kidneys are the most complicated and the functional unit of the urinary system. And then what we've got is our transport structures. So the ureters, which are tubes, transport urine that's collected from the kidneys and send it to the bladder. So they're purely just a transport tube. Our bladder stores urine until we're ready to urinate. A bit like the gallbladder, which stores bile produced by the liver. Your urinary bladder stores urine produced by the kidneys. So a bladder doesn't make things, it just holds onto it. It can hold up to a litre of urine at full capacity. Moderately full is around 500 mils. Obviously that's going to change depending on like individual size of people. And then the urethra is the structure where urine exits the body. Again, it's different with males and females. In males, this part of the urinary system is also part of the reproductive system, whereas in females, it's only part of the urinary system. So now we're going to look a little bit at understanding water and salt. And salts is the same as saying electrolytes or charged atoms, which are called ions. So sodium and potassium are also electrolytes. Water makes up almost the entire volume of bodily fluids, meaning that regardless of type, all bodily fluids are similar, and water is the main or consistent structure within that. However, the types and amounts of solutes in bodily fluids, so those are things that are like electrolytes, sodium, potassium, calcium, or like proteins, sugars, fats, anything that is a big structure that is within that water are also vitally important and can control how water moves from one space to the other. So water and electrolyte balance are tightly linked. I've got here because of what type of transport, and hopefully you thought straight away of osmosis, because osmosis is to do with the concentration of water and solutes from one side of a cell membrane to the other. So if one side is super concentrated, water will move from an area where there's less concentration to try and balance out that concentration. The solutes are too big to move across the membrane, so water moves in order to balance out concentration gradients. Here's a bit of an example of how this can work within your red blood cells. So you've got this hypotonic solution. So the solution in the beaker, it has a low concentration. So a lot of water on the outside, less solutes on the outside. The red blood cell has lots of solutes on the inside, high concentration of fluid with inside the red blood cell. So water moves into the red blood cell and it swells up. Potentially it could swell up too much. A good example of this would be if you are exercising for a long period of time in the heat, replacing lots of water but sweating lots and losing electrolytes. So now the extracellular fluid or the plasma within your blood is becoming less concentrated because you're getting rid of the solutes and only replacing the water. So now you've got this situation where inside the red blood cell, high concentration, and water will start to move into that red blood cell and swell up. Hypertonic solution is the switch. So maybe the outside of the red blood cell has high concentration of solutes. So maybe like if a nurse puts in an IV line and the concentration of salts within the IV line is too much, maybe they got the percentage wrong, the blood plasma is now going to be highly concentrated compared to the red blood cell and absorb water, and that red blood cell will shrivel up. An isotonic solution, which is often advertised in sports drinks, means that the concentration of solutes between the outside and the inside is the same, and you've got just as much water moving in as you have going out. Concentration is the same on both sides. To remain properly hydrated, we cannot lose more water than we take in, so we need to balance water intake with losing water. We get most of our water intake from fluid, but also from food ingestion, but we also produce a little bit from our metabolic metabolism during cellular metabolism. So making ATP, we can produce water. So on the left here you can see we're getting water from food, we're getting water from beverages and some metabolism. And then on the right hand side you can see how we lose fluid. And urine pretty much matches fluid loss in terms of what we get in. We lose water as vapor when we exhale, so breathing, you're losing water. We're also losing it when we sweat, and through number twos we lose water as well. Proper concentration of various electrolytes must be present both intracellular and extracellular to make sure that water balance is matched. The job of the kidneys is to juggle intake and output relationship to maintain homeostasis through the filtration, reabsorption and secretion of either water and or electrolytes. So the kidneys can retain electrolytes, get rid of electrolytes, retain water, get rid of water to maintain this balance continuously. Increased plasma solute concentration of only 2 to 3% can be detected by osmoreceptors. So osmoreceptors detect how thick a fluid is, and that can trigger the hypothalamus to say we're thirsty. So if blood plasma concentration goes up, those receptors detect this, tell the hypothalamus that we're thirsty, and that triggers our thirst sensations to start wanting to drink. A dry mouth can occur because salivary glands don't have enough water to produce saliva from the blood if you're dehydrated, and a drop in blood volume through dehydration can be detected through a drop in blood pressure, and this can also trigger the thirst response. The posterior pituitary gland, which we talked about last week, can be stimulated to release antidiuretic hormone, so that tells your kidneys to hold on to fluid. So instead of so water will be filtered through the filtration process of your kidneys and the nephron, but then what will happen is your body will reabsorb that water because of the release of ADH. Aldosterone is a hormone released by the adrenal gland, so we looked at these last week also. They can regulate concentrations of sodium ions in interstitial fluids. So aldosterone can help regulate holding on to things like electrolytes. This just shows a bit of an extension of understanding the transport system of the cardiovascular system and the different systems that we now know link to that transport system. So lungs, oxygen in, CO2 out, gastrointestinal tract, so taking food in, digesting, ingesting, digesting, absorbing fats, proteins, carbohydrates, delivering nutrients to our cells, gases to our cells, but then also our kidneys regulating water, electrolyte balance, secretion of toxins, waste, drugs through our kidneys. So you can see now how we've got this understanding of how the different systems are interacting with each other. Okay, let's look at the very last topic. I'm sure it's going to be everyone's favorite, the reproductive system. We are keeping it super simple, pretty much just going to look at structure and labeling some diagrams. But we're going to look at location and structure of reproductive system and some differences between male and female reproductive system. The reproductive system itself is actually really complicated if you look at things like, especially the female side, when you look at how awesome fertilization is and the whole idea of an embryo and a baby being developed and grown. That whole process is a big area of study. So let's just look at reproductive system. Organs of men and women produce gametes, which are our sex organs or our sex cells, so sperm and eggs. They also contribute to hormone development and secondary sex characteristics. Male testes produce sperm, whereas the female ovaries produce an egg. When an egg and a sperm join, an embryo is formed, and that's how we have a fertilized egg. Reproductive system of men and women produce offspring to ensure survival of the human species. So part of the functions of life is to make sure we ourselves stay alive. So that's the body's primary job. But the final part of that plan is to then reproduce so that your genetic material is passed on. So that's like, I guess, the ultimate survival strategy is reproduction. Gonads are the primary sex organs of the males and females, so the ovaries in the females and testes in the males. These organs produce sex cells, which are the ova, or the eggs in females, and sperm in males. In terms of hormones, testes produce testosterone, which promotes growth, maturation of organs, of reproduction, so triggers and sort of drives puberty. It's also responsible for secondary sexual characteristics, so like sex drive and the instinctual habit, or maybe not so much of a habit, but the instinctual drive to reproduce. And it's also necessary for continual production of sperm. So decreased testosterone will link to decrease in sperm production. For females, the ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen promotes growth and maturation of organs of reproduction, so that's puberty. And that's why males and females are very similar until puberty, because these hormones haven't been produced in large quantities. It's also responsible for secondary sexual characteristics, so again, that instinctual behavior of wanting to reproduce. And then progesterone maintains the process of pregnancy and prepares breast for lactation, and that whole process of growing a child, which is why during that time females become very hormones change a lot, and what's happening to the body is pretty amazing, but also has a big effect. And as we learned last week, the hormone response can be quite strong and last for a long period of time. If we look at reproductive roles, males produce sperm, deliver sperm to female reproductive tract. Females produces the egg or ova. If fertilized occurs, they also provide an environment for the offspring to develop and grow and to be born. Structurally, you'll need to be able to label these diagrams, both male and female. So you've got seminal vesicles, the urethra or ejaculatory tract. You'll see just above that is the bladder. Prostate gland, vas deferens, epididymis, penis, testicles, and scrotum. So being able to label this diagram is important, either from the lateral view or anterior, meaning the front. So same structures, but being able to label them forward and back. You'll see up the top is the bladder and the ureters, which come down, and then that links to the urethra. So you can see where the urinary system fits into this. Female reproductive system, so same thing, just different structure: ovary, the fallopian tubes, be able to identify the uterus, where a child during a fertilized egg grows, endometrium, which is the surface area within the uterus, the cervix, which I've talked about before when it comes to a positive feedback system, and just identifying the vagina compared to the urethra and how the bladder sits underneath the uterus there. Front view, same organs, just from a different side. And these structures are important to know, especially if you move into a field of study that looks at things like the menstrual cycle, working with kids around puberty age, how they develop during puberty, or if you work with pregnant women, postnatal stuff. This is very much the basics of where that understanding would start. Okay, as you see, we didn't touch on the reproductive system too much. Again, don't panic. We've got done now the nervous system, the endocrine system, urinary system with a little bit of reproductive structure and basic function. Quiz this Friday, it's the last one, and we'll look at some revision stuff for next week that will fit in for everybody. Awesome.